Back to the Future is amazing. Shocking, I know. Like many great movies in the before times, it's a cornerstone of pop culture. Iconic sayings, fun references,
So Back to the Future is a bunch of bull.
even loose inspirations. As you'd expect, there's a lot to love about this film. Almost too much. It's hard to find a lot that's wrong with this movie. That's just how it is when something is really good. And while it's fun to dunk on movies for being dumb and poorly written, it's also important to recognize what they do well. The lessons we take from classics like Back to the Future will help any aspiring writer, critic, or filmmaker. So, let's check out why Back to the Future is still fantastic. More than anything else, the writing in Back to the Future is the reason this movie holds up so well. While the writing strength isn't exactly in your face, you can sense it throughout the movie.
Hey, McFly!
For example, look at the opening scene. It's one of my favorite shots in the movie, partly because it's a super cool long take, but there's a lot of info packed into the scene. Doc's quirkiness is highlighted, and he won't even appear for another 20 minutes. There's bits of Hill Valley history and some light foreshadowing. Plot-relevant plutonium is both mentioned
plutonium was in fact stolen from
and shown. There's an advert for the truck that Marty wants.
Of the year on all 1985 model Toyotas.
And speaking of Marty, the scene ends with introducing our main protagonist to the audience. That combination of visuals and quick but meaningful lines do an excellent job at establishing details that will become relevant later. The opening is a great snapshot for how dense and efficient the writing is throughout the movie. The first act continues with establishing our main character. Marty McFly is a normal 1985 high school student. Kind of.
You've got a real attitude problem, McFly. You're a slacker.
Insubordinate and churlish.
He's fairly average at first, and actually mostly stays that way. Marty doesn't really change that much until the third movie. If I remember 10th grade English class, characters in any story can be split into either dynamic characters or static characters. Dynamic characters are the ones that change through a story. They aren't the same person from beginning to end. Michael Corleone, the movie version of Aragorn, Iron Man, you get the idea. They're popular and memorable, and for good reason. It's satisfying to watch a character grow through the course of a story. On the other hand, static characters mostly remain the same from beginning to end. Indy, the book version of Aragorn, and Captain America. No, the other one. You might be thinking, hey, a character that doesn't change very much isn't interesting at all. And you'd be half right. It's pretty easy to screw up in the wrong hands. There's lots of really cool ways to use static characters, but we'll get to those in future projects. One of the easiest ways to use them is to make static characters a contrast to everything around them. The animated versions of Superman work so well because even though Superman doesn't change very much, his goody two-shoes nature is a great contrast to the other characters.
Yeah, whatever. We still doing sushi tonight?
You know how I roll.
And this same principle is why Marty is such a great character. The other characters in Back to the Future are kinda cartoony. There's really not much nuance or complexity with any of them. Normally, this would be a huge red flag, but it's completely fine in Back to the Future because Marty ties it all together. He's a lot like the Michael Bluth of this franchise. In other words, the only sane character in a crazy cast.
Has anyone in this family ever even seen a chicken?
Marty being a static character ends up being totally fine because everything around Marty is so weird. He keeps the movie grounded in spite of the weirdness. And it helps that he's not the blandest character. You could do a lot worse for a main protagonist.
I'm the protagonist of this operation.
While he is an average, everyman kind of character, his actions and dynamics with others spice up a character that could have been very dull otherwise. After establishing our main character, the film continues to introduce elements that become more relevant later. George is a bumbling mess.
Just not very good at confrontations.
Lorraine is a dissatisfied wife and mother.
We all make mistakes in life, children.
And Biff is just
Hello? Hello? Anybody home?
the worst. After dinner with the McFlys, we get our introduction to arguably the most iconic character in the franchise.
Doc!
It doesn't need to be said that he's awesome. He's a textbook example of what a mad scientist looks
It worked!
and acts like, and I checked. He's so iconic that I didn't even know he was just a side character. As a wee lad, I thought Doc Brown was the main character for years until I actually watched the movie. But as fun as Doc is, you can tell why he isn't the main character. He's a little too wacky to carry a movie on his own. But you pair him with Marty, and baby, you've got a stew going. You see a similar recipe with other iconic duos. Batman and Robin, Sherlock and Watson, you get the idea. A normal-ish character paired with a more colorful one is a tried and true writing technique. Doc and Marty work so well because each character is good at where the other is lacking. Marty is just a regular guy, and Doc is way zanier than any regular guy. Together, they almost become the perfect character. And beyond narrative roles, Michael Fox and Christopher Lloyd have insane chemistry. They play off each other so naturally, and their chemistry really sells their friendship to the audience.
Repair the damage, you'll be next.
Sounds pretty heavy.
Weight has nothing to do with it.
What also sells it is the strong writing. Take another look back to the opening scene.
Where you been all week? Working. Where's Einstein? Is he with you?
Yeah, he's right here.
We won't see Doc for a few scenes later, but even from this brief exchange, we can tell these two are pretty good friends. There's zero time devoted to explaining how these two met or why you, as the audience, should care. Which is interesting because it's kind of a weird friendship. I looked up if there is any backstory that explains how Doc and Marty met, and turns out there is. It's actually pretty cool, and I'll post a link to it in the description. But as cool as the backstory is, the movie doesn't explain any of it, and it doesn't need to. It's a great example of how if the cast and writing is solid, you don't really need that much else. Instead of wasting time telling the audience why a relationship is important, you can show it and focus on something else instead. Anyways, Doc and Marty are great. They're fun to watch in every scene they're together, and they have a wonderful mix of both comedic scenes.
Whoa, this is heavy.
There's that word again, heavy. Why are things so heavy like futures?
And more serious moments with one another. In any case, Doc and Marty's first meetings where we get a bulk of the science and exposition. You'd think the scene that explains how time travel works would be a total snooze fest, but that's not the case here. Doc's explanations are simple and snappy.
Time circuits on. It's what makes time travel possible. The flux capacitor.
Wibbly wobbly, timey wimey.
With the audience given the bare minimum needed before moving on to something else. And the explanations are mixed with really cool visuals and good character banter.
Wait a minute. Are you telling me that this sucker is nuclear?
This entire scene is basically an exposition dump. It's a great example of little things you can add to make exposition way more entertaining. Anywho, the scene pivots as terrorists show up and turn Doc into Swiss cheese. As Marty escapes into the past, this marks the transition from the first act to the second. And as we leave the first act, I can't overstate how much setup the first act actually does.
That's a surprise tool that can help us later.
There's so many things in Back to the Future that are one-off lines or seemingly unimportant shots that end up paying off at some point later. This is a common trend throughout the movie, but it's most noticeable in the first act. Some lines, like the ones involving the main plot, are fairly obvious.
Enchantment under the sea dance.
There's a rhythmic ceremonial ritual coming up.
But then, you have character quirks.
I mean, what if they say I'm no good? What if they told me I was no good?
And simple, irrelevant details that become more relevant later. And lastly, a lot of the jokes are set up in advance.
Your Uncle Joey didn't make parole again.
You're my Uncle Joey. Better get used to these bars, kid.
I've said it already, but it's crazy how well written this movie is. There's so much in there that, honestly, didn't really need to be there. For instance, that joke about Mr. Peabody is set up by Doc.
Old man Peabody owned all of this.
And pays off when Marty time travels. But it comes back near the very end. Marty killed a baby pine tree, and in turn, changed history. And that's just one example. This video will be twice as long if I went over how much is packed into the script. There's almost no wasted line or moment in the entire movie. That might not seem like a big deal, but considering that this is a time-traveling, adventure, comedy film that's under 2 hours long, and it's really easy to see how this movie could have crumbled with the weaker script. So, after Marty's heinous murder, the second act begins with their classic fish out of water trope, where a character comes to terms with this new world they're in.
Right, give me a Pepsi free.
You want a Pepsi, pal? You're gonna pay for it.
Right away, we could see some payoff to earlier setup.
That's right, he's gonna be mayor. Yeah, I'm mayor.
and we're slowly reintroduced to the other characters. George and Biff aren't that different from their 1985 selves, but Lorraine,
Kid.
Oh, a mama's boy, huh? I'll be your mommy.
after the first of many uncomfortable encounters, Marty reunites with Doc. And I've always liked that once Marty proves he's from the future, these two pick up right where they left off. There's almost no difference in how they interact in either 1955 or 1985. And similar to their first scene together, this chat sets up the next two plot threads.
To the future!
Hey, that's the name of the show.
Once Doc and Marty figure out a plan, the movie changes gears. Everything up to this point has been this mix of science fiction and slice of life. And around the second act, it pivots to a high school comedy. It's a lot more like Saved by the Bell than Doctor Who until halfway into Act 3. Normally, a change like this might be another red flag.
Never half-ass two things. Whole-ass one thing.
But this genre hybrid is one of the film's biggest strengths. And it's really not all that different from other famous sci-fi movies. The original Alien and Terminator 1 are both horror movies with a sci-fi twist. Blade Runner is a noir film but with a sci-fi setting, just to name a few examples. These are classics for a ton of reasons, but part of their success came from using familiar elements in new ways. You see similar trends in more modern science fiction as well. Modern Doctor Who gets some criticism for being a little
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine.
overdramatic at times. But adding more human stories with the sci-fi elements is what helped push the show into the mainstream. There's more examples, but you get the idea. Back to the Future is no different. It takes science fiction ideas and combines it with familiar elements, like comedy and high school movies, to create something that appeals to a wider audience. And this isn't to say that science fiction can't work on its own. There's a lot of great movies that lean much harder into sci-fi than Back to the Future, but as amazing as those films are, the greater sci-fi focus is one of the reasons they're not as iconic as their predecessors. The weirdness in sci-fi is cool, but for the broader audience, there is such a thing as too weird. You can see this trend in Back to the Future Part 2. It's not that bad by any means, but it's a little more divisive than the first film. So, the rest of the second act follows Marty as he tries to get his parents back together. Most of the act is carried by the character interactions and the humor that comes with it. Marty is a great straight man to his father's dorkiness, and his mother's
I think a man should be strong.
forwardness. This is also when George gets a little more to his character. Even Marty is surprised.
I didn't know you did anything creative.
In a way, George is a more natural main character than his son. He's a dynamic character that changes through the course of the film. That said, he's totally fine as a supporting character, and giving George the main arc rounds out the supporting cast. Doc is Marty's partner in crime, George is the dynamic character with a character arc, 1955 Lorraine is a fun contrast to 1985 Lorraine, and Biff
Hello? Hello? Anybody home? Hi?
is still the worst. Once the character antics are wrapped up, we fast forward to the enchantment under the sea. I wish I could say more about the third act, but it's just a fantastic example of a third act that does what it's supposed to. This is the payoff to all the earlier setup. Obviously, every plan doesn't go off smoothly, but it ends up working out anyways. I do think the whole Mr. Steal Your Girl part during the dance is a little over the top, but it does reinforce George's newfound confidence. And the scene with Marty fading away is pretty cool. But if there's any scene in the film that feels unnecessary, it's the Johnny Be Good scene. From a narrative standpoint, it comes after the first resolution and doesn't really advance the story further. I have similar critiques with the chase scene earlier, but it at least pushes Lorraine closer to Marty. And it's always fun watching Biff take an L. If you cut the Johnny Be Good scene out, nothing really changes. But honestly, who cares? It's a really fun scene. I've always liked how quickly and confidently Marty takes charge.
Guys, listen to the blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Poor guy's been out of his element for the whole movie, and it's fun when he gets to be himself for a change. While it's not as plot relevant as the skateboarding scene, it's just as fun to watch. And the ending to it is one of the best lines in the movie.
Guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
With Marty's future secure, the only thread left to wrap up is Doc's inevitable demise. I personally think that this dilemma is more interesting than the actual main plot, but it's also something that belongs in a completely different movie. This subplot is in the background for most of the film, and is resolved fairly quickly anyways. It's another critique that grasps at straws more than anything. But after a few roadblocks, everything works out as planned. Marty goes home, Doc is saved, and Marty's home life gets a major upgrade. It's a little drastic, but it's cool that one small change has such drastic ripple effects. All is well in the McFly household, and with one final sequel tease, it's a happy, fitting end to a wonderful film. I almost didn't want to do a video on Back to the Future. It's amazing, and everyone knows that.
I've seen this one. This is a classic.
There's really not a whole lot that's wrong with the film. And the flaws that are there, like the one-dimensional characters, aren't really that big of an issue. The movie doesn't try to be this deep, nuanced take on the consequences of time travel. It's just a fun, science fiction adventure film. I've said fun a lot, and if there's any word to describe this movie, it's that. It was fun to watch years ago, and it's gonna be fun to revisit years from now. And just because a movie is fun, it doesn't have to be mindless. Dumb, mindless fun has its place, but there's no harm in putting in the extra work. All that effort into the writing, whether it's for the narrative or for a one-off joke, matter more than you think. It's such a good example of how it doesn't matter how simple your ideas and characters are. Making an honest effort and nailing the execution will go a long, long way. It's the reason this movie captured the hearts of audiences in 1985, and continues to decades later.